And so a will is just a tool that tells people what you want to do with your stuff whenever you pass. It does go through probate court in Georgia if you have just a will. And what that does is say this to my spouse or this to my children. And sometimes it's different percentages, sometimes it's specific gifts, but it allows us to communicate those wishes. The beauty with a will is they don't really expire. And so a lot of times people will ask, I got a will from 10 years ago. Do I need to redo it? It might be worth a second check just to make sure that it really carries out what you want it to do. But just because it's old or just because it's from a different state doesn't mean it necessarily has to be redone. Often we suggest having it reviewed after you change states just because state laws change a little bit. If you live in a state like Missouri and you pass away, a lot of your stuff was already considered your spouse's if your spouse is still alive. In Georgia, we don't have it that way. In Georgia, we don't do what's called a community property state. We only celebrate the marriage through what's called a year support. And depending on the length of the marriage and how many kids are involved, there could be more that goes to a wife. But in a state like Illinois, if it's more than 7 years, your wife essentially gets everything. And that's what most people think happens in Georgia. Unfortunately, it's not the truth, though. Georgia is one of only two states that you can actually disinherit your spouse. And
Ooh.
so you don't have to leave your spouse anything in Georgia if you don't want to. And although that's a little scary to think about, it's important for the planning side just to make sure that whatever your will says, if it's coming from another state, isn't relying on a portion of state law to transfer something to your spouse that wouldn't happen in Georgia. The next tool that we have is something that you guys have at every doctor you go to, even whenever you start new doctors down here after you move, and it's going to be what's called a Hippo release. And so, about 20 years ago now, 24 years ago now, Congress decided that our medical records were very, very secretive and they should be protected, and those are called Hippo laws. Whenever you go to a new doctor and that big packet of stuff they give you whenever you sign up for a new doctor, in there is a release that says who your doctor can speak with, and that's called a HIPAA release. Whenever we work with families, we like to give them a universal one, and the reason for that is if you're on like Kaiser insurance and you end up going to a hospital like Kennestone that's outside the Kaiser network, you're going to need a universal one for your family to be able to speak with your doctors, especially whenever you're moving and transitioning. Often you're moving from being close to one child to another one. And so you want to make sure that it's updated on there who can actually speak with your doctors, because otherwise the doctors use this as a way so that they don't actually have to speak with people because they can be charged up to $10,000 for giving out your medical information when they're not supposed to. The tool that kind of builds on that is what's called an advanced directive for healthcare. A lot of states call this a medical power of attorney. In Georgia, back around 2012, they tried to simplify it for people. They didn't do a very good job. It's really confusing for people now. But what happened is we renamed a medical power of attorney and call it an advanced directive for healthcare now. The reason for the change is that prior to 2012, a lot of people would have a power of attorney for their loved ones and think that it did both financial choices as well as medical choices. And then whenever they got in a crisis, they found out that it really just did one. And so if you're trying to make medical decisions and all you have is a financial power of attorney, it doesn't work. And vice versa, if you have a medical power of attorney but you're trying to pay bills, that doesn't work either. And so the state of Georgia legislature decided, let's simplify it for everybody by coming up with a new name, and that's how we ended up with an advanced directive for healthcare. What an advanced directive for healthcare does is allows you to name someone who, in the event that you can't make your own medical choices, will help you make those medical choices. This is a very crisis oriented tool. It really only comes into play if you have cognitive impairment, you've had a stroke, you're in an accident where you're unconscious, and we need to make very serious decisions. There's two real forms of this. One is called check the box, which is a big grid format where you go in and list next to a bunch of maladies and illnesses what level of care you'd want if you got those things. And the other version is more of a agent designation that allows for you to be able to speak with somebody, have a conversation with them, and let them know what you'd want if certain things happen to you in the future. I prefer that version of it, and the reason why is while I'm sitting here healthy, it's easy for me to say things like, I don't think I'd want chemotherapy. But if I go to my doctor tomorrow and he tells me I have cancer, My first question is really going to be what are my treatment options? And I don't feel like the check the box version does a good job of allowing people to carry out those wishes and change their mind. If you do have a check the box version of the advanced directive for healthcare and you change your mind later, you have to redo the whole thing. And your agent doesn't really have the authority to go beyond what your choices in that check the box grid are. Where if you go with more of an agent designation advanced directive for healthcare, it allows for your wishes to be flexible and for the person making those decisions to gather more information and make choices based on what they think you'd want. A big question that we run into with that then is how do we know when to pull the plug? I don't want people pulling the plug on me too early. And that's a whole nother tool called a living will in Georgia. A living will is not a DNR or what's called a do not resuscitate order. In Georgia, an attorney cannot give you a DNR. It's actually called a POLST, a physician's order for life-saving treatment, a POLST in Georgia. And it's something that is prescribed to you by your doctor and then signed off on by another doctor. And so that's not something that you can get from an attorney. In order to get one in Georgia, you have to be over 88, have severe cognitive impairment, or need assistance with 2 activities of daily living. And what that allows then is that if you do have something like a heart attack or a stroke, or you pass for any other reason, you are not to be resuscitated. Most people don't really want that, even though they say they want a DNR. I could have a heart attack right here on this chat that we're having, and modern medicine is good enough where I can probably be back at work tomorrow without anybody knowing the difference. That's pretty amazing. You know, I have a cardiac event, EMS comes, I get CPR, maybe even paddles, and I'm probably okay after that. If I have a pulse or what a lot of people refer to as a DNR, whenever the EMS comes, they don't revive me. I'm passed. And most people don't really want that until they get up in their extreme age years or they do have something that's a severe malady or some kind of chronic pain going on. A living will, though, says if I ever get so sick that I'm not going to get better, so the condition I have is irreversible and it is also terminal, so I will die from it eventually, that I don't want to be kept alive artificially. And that's really important because that allows for things like a feeding tube or a vent tube to be removed. Georgia is known as one of the states that's very, very hard to have any kind of life sustaining treatment like that removed once it's been placed if you don't have a living will in place. That can be scary because your quality of life during that period of time can be what a lot of us don't want. Most people feel very strongly one way or the other about whether or not they do want that care or not. And if you do not want that care, then it's really important that you have a living will in place. It also takes the burden off of your family. It's not like in the movies where you pull the plug and then somebody passes right away. Sometimes it does work like that, but sometimes people can still live for a few hours or even sometimes up to a couple days. Or sometimes if people do really pass right away, like in the movies, people have guilt that they waited too long. And so by having a living will, it takes a lot of that pressure off your family. The living will and the advanced directive for healthcare are tools that are very specific to Georgia. If you're moving from out of state, you probably need to get updated Georgia versions of this. And the version that you get needs to be 2016 or newer. And the reason for that is there's been some big law changes in Georgia over the last few years that make it so that if your advanced directive for healthcare is like the older one from 2012 or 2014, you have some big wins by being able to have it updated. Then we get into the financial tools. And so whenever we start talking about financial tools, remember we talked a little bit about a will. Your will, as long as it does what you want it to do, probably doesn't need to be changed or updated. It's always good to have it reviewed to make sure that it really does what you want to do in your new state. The same if you're from Georgia, moving to another state, you want to make sure that what you carry out is still going to be carried out there. Remember, like we talked about, because Georgia allows for you to disinherit your spouse and has some different spousal rules. Remember, even a Georgia will, if you really are not giving your spouse their full portion, if you go to a different state, it's going to be interpreted differently. And so we want to make sure that that's reviewed. But the bigger one is the tools that we use during your lifetime. And that's going to be a financial power of attorney. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a durable power of attorney. Whenever we start talking about durability or durable versus non-durable, what it means is that a power of attorney allows for you to step into someone's shoes and do what they can do. If it is a non-durable power of attorney, whenever that person loses legal capacity, you can't do anything for them any longer. And so what that means is say that you have a power of attorney over your spouse or over your parents, It doesn't have the durability language in it. Whenever they get cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and it goes to a point where they can't pay their bills anymore, you can't pay their bills anywhere, which defeats a lot of the purpose of having these tools. And so you want to make sure that the power of attorney you have does have what's called durability language. It means it's durable financial power of attorney that allows for you to still do things as long as that person's alive, not just whenever they have legal capacity. And that makes a big difference whenever we start talking about this. I'm sure Paula knows just over the last 5 years in general, we've seen a lot more people with cognitive impairment going into different communities and need more care. Where prior to that, we saw a lot more physical issues. I think there's a big rise in cognitive issues coming in. And especially if we look at just with the craziness of this year, whenever we want to keep our loved ones safe so that they aren't going out in the world, having a financial power of attorney to be able to help do those things for them that's strong and allows you to do everything they can do is really helpful. There are another level of estate planning tools above a will and the ones that we've talked about before. What we call, what we've discussed so far in the tool realm is what we call like our peace of mind package. And it's the introductory plan. It makes it so that you have everything you need to care for a loved one after you move. And even whenever they pass, you have certainty about what's going to go on with their estate. Some people also have a trust, whether that be a revocable living trust, a family trust, an irrevocable trust. Trusts are all administered by state law. And so if you move states, you do need to have your trust reviewed because although your trust may not need to change at all, you need to verify that it still does what it's supposed to do. In Georgia, we have very, very great trust laws that allow us to do asset protection trusts and family trusts that make sure that what you worked so hard for can be protected. But you want to make sure that if you move to a different state or if you're moving from a different state to Georgia, that you're taking advantage of all those opportunities. And because it is state by state for trust law, you have to have those reviewed whenever you change states of residence. It doesn't mean your trust needs changed, but it just does need to be reviewed. On top of that, one of the biggest things that people often forget about whenever we're doing things hastily is the insurance. And so whenever somebody's moving through, how do we make sure their Medicare is getting updated? Because Medicare is a federal program, but it's based a lot on state insurers. Whenever you move your residency, it's really important that we make sure that you have new doctors in place, that we have your insurance in place. And a lot of times people think, oh, I'll handle that whenever I get down there. And unfortunately, that's a lot of the crisis calls that we get. Somebody called and said, I was moving mom down from New Jersey. On her way down here, she had an episode. We ended up stopping in North Georgia. She got checked out at the ER, and now she's going to be here for a long while, and she's got some care coming. Well, remember that for her Medicare that she has from New Jersey, a lot of that's probably considered out of network, which means that there's going to be some high copays and deductibles, and out of pocket expenses are going to be pretty high compared to what it would be if it was something down here. Otherwise, too, the thing that we have to keep in mind is whenever you get down here, just like every other move you've ever had in your life, there's things that pop up and things get put on the back burner. And so, especially whenever we start talking about getting insurance set up, nobody likes being on the phone, nobody likes going through all that. And so, it's something that we tend to put off till later. And the time whenever we realize we should have done it is whenever something happened where we got to go to the doctors and we're scrambling to find them. We do have pretty good options down here as far as the countrywide version goes of Medicare supplements, Medicare coverage, and we have a good network of doctors in the area around Metro Atlanta. But if you don't get in it early, you don't pick ones that are right for you, you're going to be waiting and you're going to be spending a lot extra whenever you get to that point. There are Medicare brokers in Georgia that can help you free of charge for you to help find plans to make sure that you still have the insurance coverage for prescriptions and whatever maladies you may have, so that if something happens where you're coming down here and you're on a prescription, especially if you're diabetic, it's very, very imperative that you find a plan or a supplement that's going to cover those costs so that your out of pocket isn't going to be substantial. Aside from that, one of the big things that you want to do is make sure that everybody has contact information, that everybody has the tools that we talked about before. We get asked all the time, where's the best place to keep all this stuff? And I will tell you that the old adage of a safe or a safety deposit box is one of the worst places you can keep these things. And the reason for that is if it's in the event of an emergency and we need to be able to use these things, something happens where we have to make financial decisions, something happens where we got to make a quick medical choice based on that advance directive for healthcare. If that is in your safety deposit box, you are just out of luck. You don't have it, no matter how good a plan is. If you don't have access to it, it's not going to be helpful. And so in Georgia, we do allow for electronic copies of the advance directive for healthcare and the electronic copies of your power of attorney to be just as effective as the original paper copies, as long as it's drafted that way. And so like the clients we work with, we often give them a digital PDF copy that they can keep on their phone or they can keep in their email box, somewhere where they can get access to it all the way. If you're not technologically advanced like that, there's things like Everplans or even like these little wallet cards that we use, where for 15 bucks a year, you can have all this information about your allergies, your doctors, your emergency contacts, your power of attorney, your advance directive for healthcare, all kept where anybody with a medical license can get that information just by faxing it into a number. And that's really helpful because, again, the problem with like a safety deposit box or a bank or even a safe at your children's house is whenever something happens to you, do we have access to it? Most people don't get sick during bankers hours, right? And so especially like right now, whenever safety deposit box, you have to make an appointment to go get into them. It's just a really, really non-prudent way to store your things. The next step is really just making sure that we have a plan in case of emergency. So if your parents are moving in with you or your spouse is moving to somewhere like a beautiful assisted living like Merrill Gardens, how do we have a plan to care for them? How do we make sure that we're still being an advocate for them? And that's really going to be making sure we have open and clear communication, especially during these times. I just sat with a family this morning where dad went to Kennestone over the weekend. And whenever he got in there, he had a little bit of cognitive impairment and he really got poor care. And it wasn't necessarily Kennestone's fault, but because of everything going on, they asked for his son to wait out in the car while he was in the emergency room. And that was a big misstep. And so remember, especially if we have the right tools as far as the legal tools to make medical decisions, the Hippo releases, and the powers of attorney, it helps so that your advocate or your agent that you've designated can actually be in there with you while you're going through this, making sure that they can help support you. If you're in pain or you have confusion or you're going through these major medical things, it's really, really important that you have somebody there to be a second set of ears, and also, especially if you have cognitive impairment, to be able to relay some of the problems that you're having. A question such as, well, you feel okay now, to somebody that has cognitive impairment is a very leading question and can result in the person being like, well, yeah, I feel okay now, but you came in for a reason. And so we want to make sure that you have somebody that can do those things for you, be your backup, be your advocate, and help walk you through anything that life's going to throw at you as far as curveballs go. Other than that, it's just making sure that you have a good budget, making sure that you have the resources and communication so that everybody knows that there's a plan and how to execute the plan if something happens there. Moving states is always a big ordeal, but it doesn't have to be stressful. It doesn't have to be anything where we get surprises afterwards. If you have a plan in place, it's pretty easy to do that anywhere inside the U.S.